The rain had come early to Atlanta that spring. It washed down the highways and glimmered atop the black roofs of the old quarter, where age and luxury converged beneath the heavy oaks. Eloise Walker lived here, in a mansion built with both pride and pain, its stained glass windows whispering stories to those patient enough to listen. Eloise was not just known for her wealth, but for her presence, a woman whose very posture could command a room, whose hands had once stitched the wounds of her neighbors, and whose tongue could slice through hypocrisy with grace. At 68, her hair was threaded with silver, yet she wore gold, a symbol of resilience more than extravagance. Subscribe and hit like. Our powerful stories add years to your life. Join our Story Lovers Club and let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? Marcus Evans first saw Eloise in the parking lot of St. Luke's Community Center, where he worked as an assistant for local poetry readings and funded his mother's medicine by waiting tables when shifts were available. He was 24, tall and lean, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that flickered with secrets older than his years. Life had not taught him patience, but it had certainly taught him longing. He carried it everywhere, tucked behind his back, like a backpack filled with stones only he could feel. The night of the first reading seemed like an accident, both too ordinary and too crucial to the outcome that would ripple across their lives. Eloise arrived in her signature way, a sweep of silk scarf and laughter that made others nearby stand taller, speak softer. Marcus watched her from behind the microphone as he recited his poem, voice low and clear. My heart is an old house, built before I had a name, and every window aches for someone brave enough to enter. When he finished, the applause was polite, but Eloise did not clap. Instead, she nodded once, a gesture that felt to Marcus like an invitation, or perhaps a challenge. After the crowd thinned, she approached him, her cane tapping in slow rhythm. That last verse, Mr. Evans. Marcus Evans. It shook something out of me, Marcus. May I ask, who taught you to write like that? Marcus answered honestly, nobody taught me to feel. The rest came later. Eloise smiled, the corners of her mouth trembling. If you're not busy next Saturday, you must join me for supper. I don't like eating alone, and you seem a worthy companion. So began the story that Atlanta would never forget. Though most people would only ever know the rumors, Marcus accepted the invitation, heart pounding in his chest every time he replayed the syllables of her name. As Saturday neared, he tried on every shirt he owned, practiced his smile in the reflection of the rain-soaked window, and rehearsed answers to questions he guessed she might ask. Eloise greeted him that evening, wearing a velvet dress the color of ripe plums, earrings shaped like tiny suns. The house smelled of rosemary and history. Marcus ate with care, afraid the silverware would betray him, afraid of needing her approval more than he'd admit. At first, their conversation orbited safe territory: books, the neighborhood, the lost glory of downtown Atlanta. But then Eloise leaned forward, her voice soft. What do you want in life, Marcus? He hesitated, then allowed himself honesty. I want to be seen for who I am. I want love, the kind I hear about, the kind that feels impossible. I want something like what I feel when I look at you. For a moment, Eloise's fork hovered in midair. She might have chided him or laughed, or simply ignored the brashness of a young man's confession. Instead, she put her fork down and folded her hands, her gaze deepening. "You risk quite a lot, speaking that way to me." Marcus swallowed. "Some things are worth the risk." Eloise excused herself to the terrace, leaving Marcus alone with trembling hands and the scent of rosemary. Outside, she gazed through the bars of her estate's old iron gate and pondered what she had just felt, a rush of something dangerous, like wind before a storm. Weeks passed. Marcus, emboldened by her response, visited Eloise more often. Their rapport grew stranger and sweeter. He drove her to charities she managed, arrived with stories of the city's changing rhythms, wrote letters in ink on thick envelopes, smelling faintly of tobacco. He learned which newspaper she liked, which music made her cry, how she never touched a single glass of wine, not since the day her late husband died. Atlanta was not blind. People began to murmur, "That young man, he's after her fortune." Would Eloise stoop so low? At church functions, Eloise noticed her friends pulling away, eyes narrowing. One evening on the moonlit veranda, Marcus said, "You are the only person who ever listens to me. You are dazzling, not like someone's grandmother, but like a secret I wish I could keep. You make me want to write stories I never thought I'd survive." Eloise replied quietly, "Marcus, do you know what you invite? It's not just gossip. It's the kind of scrutiny that ruins lives. You are not an old soul. You are a young flame. And I am all dried wood." "I don't care," said Marcus. "I would set the whole world on fire for you." It was then the first shadow fell across their budding love. Eloise received an anonymous voicemail that night. The voice was distorted, malicious, yet clear. The old witch seducing poor Marcus Evans. The city needs to know. There will be consequences. Not long after, Eloise Foundation found itself in jeopardy. The board grew cold. Sponsors began withdrawing. At her annual gala, Gerald Walker, her late husband's cousin and nominal advisor, cornered her near the garden. "This must end. You are almost 70, and that boy wants the life you made. He'll ruin you, Eloise. Let it go before others drag it through the dirt." But Eloise would not yield. She remembered the youth she had loved long ago. A forbidden affair. A man 30 years her senior, whose absence left a wound that would never fully heal. She saw Marcus as redemption, or perhaps a chance to finally hold the impossible in her hands. The rumors spread into Marcus's own world. Strangers hurled insults at him outside St. Luke's. The kitchen staff where he worked stopped speaking to him. His mother's health grew worse. The hospital asked for money Marcus could not hope to gather. Eloise offered help, but Marcus refused, his pride cutting deeper than desperation. Then came the bribe. An envelope slid beneath Marcus's battered front door. $100,000 to leave Eloise. No questions, no noise. The offer sickened him. The following day, his mother collapsed. The hospital's bill was 3 times the bribe. Marcus faced an impossible choice: betray love or let his mother suffer. He stayed true. Instead of accepting the money, Marcus poured every waking moment into securing odd jobs, borrowing, pleading with charity foundations, all while Eloise waited, heart twisted with guilt for being the cause of his trouble. A journalist began to hunt for scandal, trailing Marcus through his neighborhood. Paparazzi photos appeared online. Eloise laughing as Marcus carried her groceries. Marcus, head bowed, opening her car door. The world spat back its verdict. She was a predator. He was a grifter. Eloise's health began to break under the weight of pressure. A stroke left her bedridden in the same house where she'd first welcomed Marcus with poetry and courage. Marcus refused to leave her side. He read her verses at night, brushed her hair in the mornings. The city moved on. The headlines faded. Their names would never be spoken as heroes. All they had left was each other. On her final night, Eloise's breath rattled in the dark. Marcus held her hand and whispered, "If you go, take my heart. All the pages you have turned in me, the golden divide between what is and what cannot be." With the little strength she had, Eloise squeezed his hand. "You are my second youth, Marcus. Remember, love is sometimes the most impossible, but it is always the most true." When Eloise was gone, Marcus stood alone in her garden, sunlight filtering through the old oaks, clutching a stack of letters she had written to him in secret. She had left him her art, her library, the house filled with her memories, but most of all, Eloise had left him changed. Years later, Marcus published The Golden Divide, lines filled with longing, defeat, and hope. Critics searched for Eloise's name, but the truth, hidden in every verse, was known only to Marcus, and to the house, and to the rain, and to those who knew that real love can endure any storm, even if the world will never forgive it. The first days after Eloise passed were a blur for Marcus, a silence so wide it seemed to swallow every sound in Atlanta. The mansion felt suddenly vast and hollow, its corners haunted by her laughter, its walls bearing the invisible pressure of everything she left unsaid. Marcus walked every room at dawn, tracing the patterns in the carpets and touching the books Eloise had once marked with notes in her looping hand. He found solace in her library, the beating heart of the house. There, behind the classical busts and photographs of vanished kin, a cedar box waited on the lowest shelf. Marcus recognized it from his childhood, a legend among the neighborhood's old folk, who whispered that Eloise kept her greatest secrets there. Now, with trembling fingers, he opened the lid. Inside lay dozens of letters addressed to him, some dated months before they met, others written on the final nights she spent confined to her bed. Each letter was the voice of a woman, both fearless and uncertain. Many told stories Marcus had never heard, fragments of a younger Eloise, as reckless and wild as he could imagine, falling in love with the world before falling in love with him. One letter, written with a shaky hand, began simply, "Marcus, you reminded me how to love the impossible." He pressed the words to his chest. Grief soon became a second skin. The city, ever fickle, shifted its attention. The scandal dispersed with Eloise's passing, replaced by a morbid interest in the terms of her will. Gerald and the remaining board members circled, hungry to discredit Marcus and claim Eloise's estate. At the reading of the will, Marcus sat alone in the grand parlor, the chandeliers burning too brightly for the occasion. He listened as the lawyer listed the bequests, furniture and capital to distant cousins, But the mansion, the art, the foundation's assets, and the entirety of Eloise's private letters were to go to Marcus. An uproar followed. Gerald stood, face flushed. She was manipulated, a boy who lived off her goodness. He doesn't deserve this. But the lawyer, calm and unyielding, read Eloise's personal addendum. If you contest this, understand that Marcus is my chosen heir. He saved me from a second death, the kind the world gives you when it forgets your heart. Marcus could barely breathe. He refused the grandeur of the mansion for weeks, sleeping in the guest room where Eloise had once tended to him after his mother's illness. He donated much of the artwork, turned down the relentless journalists, and began quietly, almost invisibly, tending to Eloise's charities. He funded scholarships in her name for women returning to school, opened clinics in underserved neighborhoods, and invited poets to paint the city with verse the way Eloise always dreamed. In the solitude of her old study, Marcus opened the cedar box again and found the oldest letter of all, dated 45 years prior. I met a man when I was young, Marcus. He was old enough to be my father, but he was life itself to me, a teacher, a lover, a secret. Our affair burned through spring and faded by winter. The loss was more than heartbreak. It was a warning. I put away the parts of myself that survived him, and I wore gold so others would see only my resilience. But I was always waiting for someone to cross the divide. Marcus carried the story with him as he went about his new life, not as an inheritor, but as a guardian of memory and possibility. He faced the city with quiet confidence, the kind that Eloise had had, patient in the face of cruelty, generous even with her wounds. One night, returning home from a poetry reading at St. Luke's, Marcus found a letter pinned to the old gate. Unlike Eloise's handwritten ones, this was typed. Unsigned, she forgave you everything. Can you forgive yourself? The question followed Marcus into restless sleep. He dreamed of Eloise's terrace, her hand on his shoulder, her voice reciting verses he wished he had written. In dream and waking, Marcus began to understand. His inheritance was not wealth, but the challenge of holding love against the tide of time, the golden divide Eloise had spoken of. Marcus tried dating other women, attending fundraisers and parties with Atlanta's elite, but no one fit the strange shape Eloise had carved in him. Her memory wasn't gentle, it was demanding. In his poems, he invoked her spirit, called down her laughter, remembered how she gripped his wrist when the world grew mean. Each stanza paid tribute, but also searched for release. Months later, as autumn colored the oaks with fire, Marcus received an invitation from an old friend of Eloise's, a woman named Barbara, who ran an art gallery downtown. Barbara spoke gently, tucking gray curls behind her ear. Eloise trusted no one but you, she said. She loved many, lost more. You must tell the true story, Marcus, before Atlanta forgets her. Barbara arranged a memorial, 1 year from Eloise's passing. Marcus spent weeks preparing, writing and rewriting the speech, gathering poems, collecting photographs others barely remembered. At the memorial, sour faces mixed with warmth. Gerald kept his distance, but most came out of respect for Eloise and curiosity about Marcus. Marcus stood before the crowd, trembling, but he pushed through. She taught me everything I know about love and risk. She dared to love when love was a scandal, not a comfort. I stand in her place, not as her son, nor as her lover, but as the keeper of her fire. He read aloud the poem Eloise had loved most. If you go, take my heart, all the pages you have turned in me, the golden divide between what is and what cannot be. Silence followed, but it was a gentle silence, the kind that fell when the truth settled into the bones of a room. After the memorial, Marcus walked as Eloise had walked, down Peachtree Street, feeling her presence beside him, a woman undiminished by gossip or grief, radiant in legacy. Back at the mansion, Marcus began planning changes. He broke open the gates Eloise had once locked against the world, opening the grounds for public readings, workshops, and picnics. He invited the city's youth, the elders who remembered Eloise's first laughter, the lonely and the lost. Where scandal had painted darkness, Marcus let in light. And slowly, over the years, as the city shifted and mourned, Marcus found peace, not in forgetting, but in keeping Eloise's spirit alive at the heart of Atlanta's story. In the weeks after the memorial, Marcus found himself increasingly drawn to the box of letters. Each time he opened it, he would read one at random, let the words swirl through him, and then close his eyes, trying to imagine Eloise as she had been before the world built its walls around her heart. One gray afternoon, as rain drummed the windows, Marcus retrieved a particularly thick envelope, marked not with his name, but with a simple gold initial, E. Inside he found not a letter, but a diary, pages yellowed and fragile, the handwriting finer than anything he'd seen from Eloise in recent years. He began to read, and her world unfolded before him. June 12th, 1968. I went to the museum again today. Mama says I walk like I own the place, though I do nothing but stare at the paintings and dream of how the light once touched other people's faces. Today, he saw me, the man in the linen suit. He smiled, and all I could think about was sunlight on an empty canvas. Marcus turned each page carefully, feeling the echo of forbidden excitement, the giddy, reckless certainty of first love. As the days became weeks in the diary, Eloise's entries grew bolder. July 2nd, 1968. He recites verse I've never heard before. Lines, he says, belong to ancient poets, men who died for love, or perhaps lived only in those small, stolen moments. He is so much older than me. His hair is turning gray. He smells of pipe smoke and expensive soap. Every rule, every warning feels like dust compared to the way he looks at me. I think he might truly see me. No one else ever has. Marcus's heart pounded, suddenly understanding the pattern behind Eloise's affection for impossible, shimmering longing, the constant thread through her life. He closed the diary, but years of Eloise's secrets, pain, and hope seeped into his dreams. That night, he dreamed of her as a young woman, running breathless beneath magnolias, her laughter weaving with the sound of distant jazz, her eyes finding those of a man who felt both danger and salvation. He would write the story into poetry, a cycle of verses, piecing together Eloise's hidden years, blending them with his own heartbreak, so that Atlanta at last might understand their love was never a transaction or a mistake, but the echo of something generations old. He set to work in her study, scattered with pages and old photographs. The world outside seemed to move on, indifferent to Eloise's memory. Gerald had lost his court bid. The tabloids found new scandals, and Marcus's own name faded from headlines. Yet within the city's underground scene, word of his readings spread. Young poets came to the house with battered notebooks and nervous hope, seeking the kind of honest kinship Eloise had once offered Marcus himself. One warm night, a visitor arrived, an aging man named Louis, who'd worked as Eloise's gardener decades before. Louis sat with Marcus on the veranda and shared what he remembered. She always had this spark, was told too many times how to live, how to love. I think it made her love harder, you know. Not wild in the way folks gossip, but with so much depth it spared people. She took in strays. She reached for beauty even when it cost her. That's what people forget. That's what they never could forgive. Marcus recorded Louis's words and those of others who visited, constructing a mosaic of Eloise that was so much more profound and sorrowful and fierce than the tabloid's villain or saint. But even as he honored her, Marcus was not free of regret. Alone late at night, after the last poetry workshop ended and when the garden fell silent, he sometimes feared he had been more burden than blessing in Eloise's final years. The old anonymous note haunted him. She forgave you everything. Can you forgive yourself? Unable to answer, Marcus poured his doubts into his poetry. Winter settled over Atlanta, crisp and unyielding, and Marcus began waking early, pulled from dreams by the urge to walk the city before sunrise. On one such morning, frost painting the streets, he encountered a familiar face outside the gates. Barbara, Eloise's gallery friend. She carried a small painting, its surface obscured by brown paper. "I think it's time you saw this," she said. Inside the warmth of the kitchen, Barbara unwrapped the painting. It was a portrait, unmistakably Eloise, painted as a young woman. In the background stood a man, his features gentle, hair already silvering, his eyes fewer in detail, but rich in longing. "She never told me his name," Barbara whispered, "but every year she insisted this painting be restored, kept perfect. She said, 'One day someone I love will need to see that I lived bravely, even when it cost everything.' She was talking about you, Marcus." For a long time, Marcus gazed at the portrait. Suddenly, so much made sense. Eloise's fascination with poetry, older men, the gold she wore as both armor and memory, her refusal to dismiss even the most reckless forms of love. He hung the painting in the library, beneath Eloise's favorite stained glass window, so sunlight struck her cheek, illuminating not youth or regret, but simple, defiant hope. That evening, as the city drummed with distant music and new rain, Marcus hosted another poetry night, the biggest yet. Children, elders, young artists, and former skeptics clustered beneath the oaks, their words circling up to the stars. When it was his turn, Marcus recited the poem he'd written that very morning, inspired by Eloise's diary and the portrait. "We are not the age they say we are. We are the moment between two heartbeats. You taught me hope is the most forbidden thing. Still, I carry it like gold, in the dusk, and in your memory." The crowd sat in rapt silence, and then rose to applaud. Not Marcus, not just Eloise, but the promise that love, even across the deepest divides, could change both hearts and history. As the garden emptied that night, and the last lanterns were extinguished, Marcus stood just a moment longer, gazing into the dark, his soul at peace. In the lingering hush, he felt Eloise at his shoulder, hand resting lightly on his back, her laughter promising that an impossible love was not wasted, but written, in rain, in gold, and in the enduring light of a new day. In the months following the poetry night beneath the oaks, Marcus felt the rhythm of his life shift. The house became vibrant again, a living, breathing place where Eloise's memory didn't linger as a shadow, but as a presence that inspired and anchored him. He accepted invitations to read at universities and bookshops, carrying the story of Eloise, her wisdom, her rebellion, her infinite care, into new places. But no public recognition dulled the ache that resurfaced at night. Sometimes, sitting in Eloise's old chair, Marcus found himself longing for her advice, hungering for those moments when she saw beyond his anger or uncertainty and spoke a truth only she could shape. He missed her stories of youth and heartbreak, the ones that made sense of his own chaos. One unseasonably warm evening, Marcus wandered through Eloise's attic, a place heavy with objects few had touched in decades. He found trunks stuffed with outdated dresses, faded hats from a different era, crumbling photo albums, and, beneath a pile of dust cloths, a battered tape recorder. Inside, a cassette was already loaded. Written on its label in Eloise's handwriting was a single word: courage. Curiosity stirred. Marcus brought the tape player down, fixed the old batteries, and pressed play. Eloise's voice, a little higher and filled with laughter, filled the silent library. "If you're listening, Marcus, the house must have outlived me. Don't let the attic scare you. You'll find my confession in every memory up there. I recorded this for the days when you need something heavier than verses, something real. You asked me once if I regretted loving across years and rules and hearts. The truth is, the only regret I have is not shouting about it sooner." She chuckled, and in the pause, Marcus heard distant birdsong, as if Eloise had recorded it on a spring morning. "I know you worry that you cost me friends. Maybe you even wonder if loving me made your life smaller. But that's the trick, darling. Without you, my world would have shrunk to shadows and silence. You made me present. You made me wild again. Don't you ever let sorrow tell you otherwise." The tape whirred quietly for a while before Eloise continued, softer. "Remember, it is noble to love what the world calls impossible, to fight for it, to kneel for it, to lose sleep and gain scars for it. Don't stop. Use the love you carry to shape your art, your work, your every morning. That's your part of the legacy. Now don't you go hiding in these attic shadows. Go outside. Let the world see who we were." Marcus wiped his eyes as the tape clicked to an end. With new resolve, he devoted himself even more fiercely to the foundation Eloise left. He brought in counselors to help young people who faced the kind of judgments they had. He partnered with churches and universities, breaking through the old shame and suspicion with the power of testimony and poetry. In time, he was invited to speak at the opening of a new community art center in Eloise's old neighborhood. The city's skeptical gaze seemed softer now, warmed by Marcus's quiet consistency, the generosity of the foundation, and the echo of Eloise's grace. On the night of the inauguration, Marcus stood before a mural, a vibrant silhouette of Eloise, arms open, painted by local artists who had never met her, but felt her impact through Marcus's work. He told the crowd, she believed love is an act of courage, not the kind that ends wars, but the kind that gets you through a single hard day. Every painting, every poem, every voice raised here carries a part of her dream. I am but one person who held her hand for a time. The rest is up to all of us. After the applause, an older woman, Mrs. Willoughby, a long-time neighbor, once among Eloise's fiercest critics, approached Marcus with a tentative smile. She changed, you know, after she met you. Used to be, she kept her garden closed, kept her words tight. You made her laugh in church, made her argue with Mr. Gerald about everything and nothing. That woman needed someone to remind her of the fire. I was wrong to judge it, son. I'm sorry. Her apology, unexpected and humble, broke something open in Marcus. He felt, for the first time, that the city was finally learning the truth of Eloise, not as the headline or the cautionary tale, but as a person who chose and suffered and loved bravely. The garden at the estate became a site for celebration and remembrance. Every year on Eloise's birthday, Marcus welcomed friends, poets, critics, skeptics, and those healed by acts of impossible love. They read her favorite verses, they shared stories, sometimes bitter, more often joyful. The circle grew every season, new faces drawn by the legend, but kept by the reality Marcus had worked so gently to craft. Late one summer night, as the last guests drifted away and fireflies blinked in the shadows, Marcus sat beneath the magnolia tree where he'd first confessed his love to Eloise. He closed his eyes and listened to the soft city sounds, the laughter carried over from distant porches, the memory of her voice still guiding, always brave. I am enough, he whispered into the warm darkness. We were enough, and he knew, finally, with the kind of peace that doesn't erase pain, but honors it, that the golden divide was not a chasm to be filled with regret, but a bridge, one built from longing, courage, and the kind of love that never quite leaves, no matter how impossible the world claims it to be. As the years unfurled, Marcus grew into a quiet icon of Atlanta's cultural life. Eloise's mansion was no longer just a relic of a storied scandal. It had become a symbol of resilience, transformation, and the redemptive power of difficult love. The city changed, as cities do. Old buildings surrendered to glass towers, and new faces populated the neighborhoods Eloise once walked like a queen. Yet the library, the gardens, and the art rooms remained as she had wished, humming with activity from dawn until midnight. Marcus, now in his 30s, watched the next generation blossom. Sometimes he felt invisible, a ghost among the lives he nurtured, but more often he found peace in the anonymity of service, in the rhythm of giving without expectation. It was on one unusually windy autumn afternoon, while organizing a youth workshop in poetry and public speaking that Marcus met Aria, a young teacher with a staccato laugh, hair always in a riot, and eyes that seemed as quick to spot beauty as sorrow. Aria grew up on the stories of Marcus and Eloise, or at least the versions that filtered through schools and family gossip. She carried her curiosity openly. At first, their meetings were practical. Aria proposed projects. Marcus weighed in with his habitual calm. She marveled at the mansion's echo and asked fearlessly about Eloise, braving the reverence that usually kept people's questions polite and distant. One December night, after a particularly raucous slam poetry final, they lingered together amid the battered folding chairs, sipping too sweet cider, trading stories. Aria finally pressed the question that had been building between them. "Don't you get tired of loving a ghost, Marcus? Atlanta can't see you as anything but her inheritor. Don't you want to be loved for yourself?" He hesitated. Part of him recoiled, as if love beyond Eloise was betrayal. But Aria's eyes were steady, her voice softer than usual. Her question echoed some deep internal longing Marcus had never voiced, not even to Eloise in her final days. "I don't know if I remember how," he admitted quietly. Aria reached over, warm palm on his hand. "You honor her best by living, not just surviving. Living." That night Marcus didn't sleep. He walked the halls of the mansion, touching walls, smiling at memories, a new joy blooming where pain had lived so long. Years of grieving gave way, slowly, to the possibility that caring for others, forging new ties, would not diminish his devotion to Eloise, but deepen it, giving it roots in the world she saved him for. With Aria, love was less a blaze and more a gentle, persistent light. She did not try to fill the places Eloise had left. She brought color and laughter into new corners, shared old books, and challenged Marcus to write poems not out of absence, but out of hope. The city, too, seemed to heal around them. Older neighbors who once had crossed the street now met them in the garden for quiet tea. Gerald, softened by age and finally ready to let old battles rest, appeared on the doorstep one day with a box of Eloise's childhood belongings. Without bitterness, he said simply, "Perhaps you'll know what she wanted kept." Together, Marcus and Aria organized an annual Courage Festival, not just to remember Eloise, but to celebrate every kind of love that had ever dared to break Atlanta's rigid rules. Friendship, romance, art, healing. The poems on the lawn grew wilder and kinder. Children raced through magnolia shade. Visitors left with rhymes and hope trailing after them, a promise that the city would always be bigger than its fears. On the 10th anniversary of Eloise's death, after the crowd's laughter faded and the lanterns flickered low, Marcus sat in the library, the old portrait of young Eloise glowing in the firelight. He was not alone. Aria leaned against the doorframe, watching him carefully. He traced the glass of the portrait, his reflection overlapping with Eloise's painted face. The ache in his chest had sharpened into something else. Not sorrow, but gratitude. He spoke aloud, voice low but steady. "I loved you, and you taught me all I needed to stand here now. I'll love again, not to replace you, but because that's how I keep carrying you forward." Aria crossed the room and squeezed his hand. For the first time in a decade, Marcus wept not for what was lost, but for everything he had been given. Outside, somewhere beyond the garden, rain fell lightly. Atlanta glimmered. In the mansion, in the hearts that pulsed beneath its roof, the story of Eloise lived on, not only in memory, but in the beauty and courage of every love that dared to begin again. The seasons cycled through Atlanta, each year writing new lines into the story of the mansion, the gardens, and the hearts that gathered there. Marcus and Aria's love, gentle and wise, soon became a fixture, as familiar as the old camellias Eloise once pruned, or the laughter that drifted through open windows each summer evening. As the Courage Festival grew and children's voices threaded through the poetry nights, Marcus noticed how the young poets and painters didn't know the darkness that had once defined the estate. To them, Eloise was a legend of resilience, a woman who loved fiercely and left the world braver. The gossip and shame, once so sharp and raw, had faded into myth, sanded down by time and community grace. It was on one particularly warm spring morning that Marcus noticed a girl, no more than 7, tracing her fingers across the inscription on the garden's sundial. Dahila was her name. One of the neighborhood children Aria had taken under her wing. She asked Marcus, with the seriousness only children possess, was Eloise real, or just a story someone tells when they want to make people feel strong? Marcus knelt beside her, sunlight warming his shoulders. She was as real as you or me, he said softly. But when someone loves with their whole heart, so much that it changes people, their story does grow larger and brighter, like a lantern. That's how we remember her. Dahila nodded, and with the confidence of the very young, declared, "When I grow up, I'm going to be as brave as Eloise." "Will you teach me the poems?" So every Wednesday, Marcus and Aria held a bravery circle in the garden, teaching poetry, music, and stories to the neighborhood's children. The circle became a sanctuary, one not only for the young, but for those adults who still carried old hurts. The ones who needed to believe that lives could be remade, that sorrow and shame could yield to beauty, kindness, and truth. As years rolled forward, the mansion began to show its age. Aria, ever practical, led a campaign to restore the stained glass and repair the roof, drawing on city grants and the blessings of neighbors who once might have voted to see the estate torn down. Elderly Mrs. Willoughby, now the honorary matron of the festival, led tours, telling school children, Atlanta blooms a little brighter now because Eloise and Marcus planted courage here. At home, Marcus's poetic voice changed too. His later poems were less haunted, gentler. He wrote of the way sunlight threads through old lace curtains, the sound of laughter carried on summer wind, the courage of children learning their first song. He wrote for himself and sometimes for the child Aria soon brought into the world, a daughter, sweet-tempered and clever, with Aria's bold gaze and Marcus's dimpled smile. On the day she was born, Marcus sat in the library, the baby swaddled in Eloise's old quilt. He looked at the portrait, then at his daughter, and whispered, "Your world is different because someone dared to love without apology. We will never teach you shame for who you are or who you love." Years from now, the city would remember not just Eloise's scandal or Marcus's sorrow, but the garden, the festivals, the circle of young poets beneath magnolia blooms, the living proof that even the deepest wounds can become roots for astonishing beauty. And so, long after Marcus's hair silvered and Georgia thunderstorms rattled the mansion's eaves, the circle continued. In that garden haven, the city's children learned what it meant to be brave, to forgive, to love, and to outgrow shame. They learned that the Golden Divide wasn't a punishment, but a path, one first walked by a fearless woman named Eloise, and carried on by those who cherished the gifts she left behind. With every poem recited and every hand held, Eloise's legacy lived anew, not in whispers or rumor, but in sunlight, laughter, and the courage to begin again. Spring in Atlanta brought a wild green to the city. The kind Eloise used to say reminded her of possibility. Marcus and Aria, now partners in every sense, had settled into a rhythm. Workshops, late-night conversations on the veranda, sunrise breakfasts in the bricked garden where Eloise's favorite roses kept blooming despite all odds. The Courage Festival had blossomed from a single afternoon to a full week. Every year, new faces brought new stories, and the crowd grew more diverse. Immigrants, artists, activists, elders, and children, all sharing space on Eloise's lawn. The house no longer felt haunted, but alive, as if Eloise herself might round the corner at any moment, with a mischievous quip and an armful of books. One quiet evening, after the bustle of the festival, Marcus found a small group of teenagers gathered on the library steps, their voices hushed in awe. They'd been reading from Eloise's diaries, the sanitized selections he sometimes shared at workshops, and arguing sweetly about the meaning of courage. A girl with close-cropped hair spoke up as Marcus joined them. "Marcus, were you ever afraid that loving someone would ruin your life?" Her friends leaned forward. The question was blunt, but so familiar. He could have sworn it echoed right out of the house's walls. He sat beside them in the warm dusk, considering. "I was terrified," he told them. "But Eloise used to say the terrible thing wasn't loving. It was pretending you didn't. Some people run from that fear their whole lives and call it safety. Lessons bloom. Courage looks like foolishness to people who have never tried." The girl nodded slowly. "Do you think she'd want us to be that brave?" He smiled then, a genuine, shining thing. "She left this home for you, for every kind of impossible love. Your story hasn't been written yet. Write it in light." Later that night, alone with Aria in the study, Marcus confessed how deeply the moment resonated. "They remind me of us, of how uncertain and reckless it all seemed at first." Aria squeezed his shoulder. "They'll carry the torch, Marcus, and someday you'll let them carry you." 2. Days grew warmer, and the mansion's rooms seemed to vibrate with hope. Aria encouraged Marcus to finally finish his collected poems, those written both before and after Eloise, the joyful and the grief-stricken, the odes and confessions. She edited, laughed, sometimes cried at the table as the manuscript grew thicker. When Marcus's book, Gold Between Us, was finally published, he didn't expect much beyond the circle of local admirers. But reviews came, glowing and surprised, describing a work that grappled with scandal, memory, and the stubbornness of love. Marcus was invited to read on stages he had once visited only as an acolyte of Eloise's legend. He always told the truth, This story wasn't just lived, it was inherited. And if you are brave, one day it might belong to you too. On a luminous spring evening, after a reading downtown, Marcus and Aria returned home to children playing in the garden. Children whose laughter sounded like new verses beginning. As dusk melted into dark, Marcus took Aria's hand and led her onto the broad old porch. "I used to think legacy meant defending a memory," he said, voice soft. "But it's more than that. It's letting your story become shelter for others. It's letting go a little so others can start again." Aria pressed her cheek to his shoulder. "The city's not just surviving. It belongs to the brave now." As fireflies blinked across the lawn, Marcus whispered a word of gratitude, not only for Eloise and the pain he'd survived, but for every heart that dared to join him in the great unfolding story. And somewhere, in the hush between memory and invention, Atlanta itself seemed to sigh, as if blessing the house that once was scandal, then sanctuary, and now stood utterly transformed by all the wild, impossible love it held. The mansion outlasted Marcus. By the time the city paved new roads and skyscrapers threw their shadows across the old gardens, his hair had grown entirely silver, and the laughter of children who ran through the Courage Festival was the heartbeat of his days. Aria aged beside him, ever vibrant, her presence as sustaining as the memory of Eloise had once been. On Marcus's last morning, the house was quiet except for birdsong. He sat in his favorite chair by the window, Eloise's old seat, recovered and softened by use, watching rays of light paint gold patterns on the library floor. His daughter, grown now, and Aria shared coffee, both sensing the weight of the day. Marcus spent his last hours reading fragments of poems, feeling the gently persistent ache of a story lived fully. When the final dusk came, Marcus asked to be taken to the garden. Beneath the magnolia tree, among roses Eloise once tended, he whispered gratitude to the morning breeze. He closed his eyes, letting memory fill the space. The first rebellious poems, the scandal that nearly broke him and Eloise, the years of healing, the children's laughter, the gentle, steady love of Aria. They buried Marcus beneath the magnolia beside Eloise's memorial stone, a simple act, a final joining. His daughter organized a festival in his name the next year. The city came. Old friends, young poets, neighbors, critics, even former adversaries. They read from gold between us, shared stories and laughter, and planted new roses in the garden, vowing, as Marcus had, to teach courage in every season. Years passed. The mansion became the House of Courage, its history taught as testament that love, especially the forbidden, the difficult, the relentlessly generous, could survive anything time or scandal could muster. Aria grew old, beloved by the community, guiding new leaders, watching her daughter take up the torch with pride. Sometimes, in the quiet of the library, she would sense Marcus and Eloise laughing from some distant, sun-drenched place. One autumn, decades after Marcus's passing, the city convened a gathering on the estate's lawn. Eloise's grandniece, now a poet herself, read from an old tape, a fragment of Eloise's voice, urging listeners to be wild and gentle and impossibly brave. The crowd fell silent, then erupted in applause. New generations had come for stories and stayed to make new legends. The magnolia, ancient and sprawling, grew in the golden divide between memory and hope. Beneath its shade, the children of Atlanta learned poems about shame, forgiveness, and the fierce miracle of loving beyond fear. They grew up believing courage was ordinary, that justice could bloom in gardens tended by those once cast out. And in every festival, every circle of verse and laughter, the story of Eloise, Marcus, and those who followed pulsed quietly on, not as scandal, but as redemption, not as lesson, but as invitation. The city was changed, forever, by the hearts that dared to cross the divide and make a home of it. In the end, love had outlasted everything. The mansion stood, and the golden divide was gone, transformed by a legacy of wild, impossible, undying courage.